Hello everyone, and welcome to the second in my series of London walks. This one is called Emma Walks Chelsea. My first walk was Fulham, which is where I live now, but I've chosen Chelsea as my second walk because I've spent most of my life living in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. I was actually born in Chelsea itself and spent much of my adult life here bringing up my two children. In case you haven't listened to me before, my name's Emma, and I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide. That means I'm one of about 600 professionally qualified tourist guides for London. Normally at this time of year, I'd be taking people all around the main sites of London, as well as its wonderful museums and galleries and so on. But because we're in lockdown, I can't do that at the moment, and so I thought instead I'd share with you some of the places of London that I really love, and give you a little bit of background history so that next time you go walking around, you might know a little bit more about the area. So let's get started with the first slide. This is a photograph of me standing down by the River Thames close to Albert Bridge. That's the pink and blue bridge in the background of the photograph, with a few old barges in front of it just behind me. The Chelsea embankment forms the southern boundary, as it were, of Chelsea. And I included that photograph just to remind us that Chelsea is very much on the banks of the River Thames. It also made me giggle when I looked at it and realised that my clothes matched the bridge rather well. So let's get started at Sloane Square. It's at the west edge of the ancient village of Chelsea, next to smart Belgravia, with Sloane Street there going north towards Knightsbridge and Harrods. Sloane Street itself is lined with designer shops, and the residential housing off to both sides of it, all the way up to Hyde Park, are very, very high-end, I should say. We're actually going to go off the other way, down towards the southwestern part of London, towards Putney Bridge, along King's Road. King's Road was a very ancient road, and it long predated Sloane Square, where we're standing now. But before we set off, there are just a few things about Sloane Square itself that I'd like to point out to you. First, see the Royal Court Theatre, which opened in the 1880s and has had a long and illustrious history as a place showcasing new plays and young playwrights. Back in the day, there were people like George Bernard Shaw, John Osborne, Harold Pinter and Samuel Beckett. Perhaps today, names more recently recognisable would be Carol Churchill or Jez Butterworth. It does a great job still today. Next door is Sloane Square Underground Station. That's the modern building on the right-hand side. Although it opened in 1868, it was badly bombed in World War II, and indeed 80 people were killed when a bomb landed on it in November 1940 during the Blitz. Also, if you do go down to the platforms, be very careful where you stand, because a river runs right over your head. The Westbourne is in a green box on its way from Notting Hill, where Portobello Market can be found, down to the River Thames. I might be a little superstitious, but I never stand underneath it. The fountain was a gift to Chelsea from the Royal Academy, to note its arty background, and it has a relief on the base showing King Charles II and his mistress Nell Gwyn. She's supposed to have had a house at the end of King's Road, and the king would have stopped off for a visit on his way to Hampton Court. Incidentally, you needed a special coin minted with the king's head on it that gave you permission to go down the King's Road, because it was completely private, as a thoroughfare for the royals to get from St James's and their palaces of London down to places like Hampton Court. And indeed, it didn't open to the public until the early 1800s. Even before Chelsea was swallowed up by London and was still quite a small rural village, it was always quite a cool place. For centuries, people have come to Chelsea to party, whether it was to Ranelagh Gardens in the 1700s, or Cremorne in the 1800s, or whether it was when Chelsea burst onto the scene in the 1960s as part of London's swinging city, when rock stars like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, David Bowie, the list is endless, all made it down to Chelsea to go to the clubs and the pubs and buy their clothes in the trendy boutiques. opening up all down the King's Road. At the other end of Sloane Square, to the Royal Court Theatre, is another great Chelsea institution, and this is the department store Peter Jones. John Betjeman, the poet, said nothing bad could happen in Peter Jones, and I do tend to agree. Its graceful curtain wall from the 1930s follows the curving line of the King's Road, and that's where we're headed next. A little further down the King's Road, we come to the Duke of York's Square. The Duke of York's barracks used to actually be a home for army children, and it opened in the early 1800s. It later became the headquarters of the Territorial Army, and for years was hidden behind a great brick wall. But the Cadogan Estates bought it in the early 2000s and turned this into the public space that it is today, full of shops and restaurants. It also now houses the Saatchi Contemporary Art Gallery. The Cadogan family still own a lot of Chelsea, which they acquired in part by inheritance from this man. And here's his statue, Sir Hans Sloane. This is a copy of the one of him in the Chelsea Physic Garden, and we'll peek in there later on. He was a doctor to 3 monarchs, and also to the governor of the colony of Jamaica. He's said to have made his fortune by patenting a recipe for using the cocoa bean to make a sweet drink thought to have beneficial medicinal qualities, and that was drinking chocolate, which he sold to the Cadbury family. When he died, his vast collection of a lot of natural specimens, by then kept at Cheney Manor in Chelsea, became the core starter collection of the British Museum, which opened in Bloomsbury in 1753. The government was able to buy the collection for 1/5 of its value for £20,000. So thank you very much indeed to Sir Hans. I think you'll agree that Sir Hans definitely earned the right to have many of the streets and squares of Chelsea named after him. Think of Hans Place, Hans Square, Sloane Street, Sloane Square, etc., etc. In fact, a large part of the northern part of the borough of Chelsea, which was redeveloped in the late 1700s, actually became known as Hans Town. Blacklands Terrace, named after the terrible Blacklands of Chelsea, where you would be robbed if you didn't go suitably armed or in a well-guarded group, has rather a different reputation today. Ironically, it's one of the streets in Chelsea which I would highly recommend that you do go to. And this is because of the most marvellous bookshop, John Sandoe. Started by John Sandoe and then taken over by the fantastic Johnny DeFalbe and his team, it's now bigger and better than before. Although sadly shut just at the moment, they're still delivering books. And when it reopens, if you've not been there before, I do urge you to pay a visit. It's an absolute literary wonderland. And after you've whiled away a few hours browsing through their amazing collections and discussing what would be your next great read with the very knowledgeable staff, you might have worked up a bit of an appetite and you could go just down the road to the award-winning 5 Fields restaurant. I've taken a photograph of 2 houses that face you at the very end of the road to give you an example of the architecture that became known as Pont Street Dutch, very characteristic of Hans Town, that was rebuilt again in the late 1800s in this European and rather Dutch style of architecture with tall, thin, gabled houses, echoing perhaps those that you would see in the old cities of Holland, like Amsterdam, for example. Carrying on down the King's Road, we get to a wide gravel avenue to our left, lined with lime trees. This is Royal Avenue, which leads down to the Royal Hospital. And here are a couple more photos of it. I'll be coming back to this later. For the moment, we're staying in the 20th century, and here on the corner of Royal Avenue is this 1970s building which used to be called the Chelsea Drugstore. It's now a McDonald's, and I don't think anyone would write a song about it, but it used to be so cool that it was mentioned by the Rolling Stones in their song You Can't Always Get What You Want, and featured in the film A Clockwork Orange. A film called The Servant, starring a young and incredibly handsome Dirk Bogarde, was filmed in Royal Avenue because the director Joseph Losey lived here. And indeed he did so until he died. Carry on a little bit to the gracious Wellington Square, opening on our left, with its private garden in the centre. James Bond's flat was supposed to be here at number 30. And if you look opposite, on the other side of the King's Road, you'll see Bywater Street, with its bijou painted cottages, where George Smiley, the creation of John le Carré, lived. We really should call this Spy Central. A little bit further on, we come to Joe and the Juice on the corner of Markham Square, with the Santander Bank next door. Who knew that Joe and the Juice was where Mary Quant opened her first boutique bazaar with her boyfriend Alexander Plunkett Green in the late 50s? Long after they closed down, there was a basement restaurant there called Alexander's. Whether or not Mary Quant actually invented the miniskirt, she was certainly the person who made it coolest. She said that the girls who she sewed the A-line skirts for used to come back every day begging her to make them shorter and shorter. They look great with high boots. Next door, the bank used to be called the Markham Arms Pub, and it was a haunt of East End gangsters like the Cray twins, and also where two Soviet spies, Anthony Blunt, the master of the Queen's pictures, one might remember, and Kim Philby were supposed to have met up. Opposite, there's a very nice comparison of a townhouse with a blue plaque on it. And this is dedicated to P.L. Travers, the creator of Mary Poppins. So without her, we never would have had those marvellous films, just remade and just as good as the old one, I think, or, even more of a favourite of mine, Saving Mr. Banks. And the film crews for that film had 1 day's filming on location in London, just to establish the location of this house. So I love to think of Tom Hanks coming here to find Emma Thompson and beg her to give him the film rights to her book. Before we head off to look at the Royal Hospital, there's one last thing to see in this part of King's Road, and that is the Pheasantry. It's now a Pizza Express and cabaret venue, but it used to be a private club, and all sorts of people have been there. For example, Margot Fontaine took ballet lessons there, and Eric Clapton played live there. Queen played, Lou Reed, local artists, Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon were regulars. You name it. Now, because this isn't a real walk, we can magic ourselves down to the Royal Hospital, Chelsea. So here we are at the Royal Hospital. There's a Nell Gwyn connection here, as it is said that she was the one who persuaded Charles II that it would be a good site for a hospital and retirement home for army war veterans. He agreed, and it opened to its first residents in 1692, and they are still here today. It was designed by Sir Christopher Wren and other architects like Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, and its gardens are home to posh events like the Chelsea Flower Show. Sadly, though, not this year. And Mrs. Thatcher and her husband, Dennis, are interred in the burial ground of the hospital. The Chelsea pensioners, as we call them, look wonderful in their scarlet or blue uniforms and can often be seen around Chelsea, especially in the local Waitrose supermarket, and they're often happy to stop for a chat. There's a new statue of one of the pensioners on the forecourt, waving his stick, looking rather splendid. And it's a companion piece to a bright gold Charles II on the other side in the courtyard, which you can't see. The Duke of Wellington lay in state before his funeral and burial in St Paul's Cathedral. The gravel sweep, which goes through Burton Court with its cricket pitch, tennis courts and dog walking for Chelsea residents, best gossip in town here, was intended by William III to extend all the way to Kensington Palace, but it never got further than the King's Road. An example of the many grand building plans for London that never got to completion, such as Wren's City or Regent's Park, and I think this all adds to London's charm. Ranelagh Gardens next door, to the left by the river, is only accessible through the hospital grounds, and it's a wonderful landscaped garden. In the 1700s, it was one of London's most famous and fashionable pleasure grounds, full of the beau monde of the day who parted there in the rotunda and supper boxes, sort of painted picnic shelters, painted and decorated by well-known artists of the day. An 8-year-old, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, gave a concert there, and Horace Walpole, the wit and diarist, said you couldn't go there without tripping over a Duke of York or a Duke of Cumberland. These were the brothers of the king. I think the restrained and elegant architecture of the hospital itself, so typical of Rennes, which would have let in lots of light, speaks for itself. There's lots more history of the hospital on their website, and you can go in for a visit. I highly recommend this when you are able. Next, as you walk west, you come to the National Army Museum. Been here since the 1970s, and it tells the history of the British Army since its very earliest days. They've got Florence Nightingale's lamp in there and the skeleton of Napoleon's horse. This year, the Army Museum is joining forces with the National Museum of the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force Museum to host a free online festival bringing to life the stories of those who helped deliver victory in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. So this was due to be the 75th anniversary, and the many, many outdoor events and so on have had to be cancelled, but we can all do it virtually. And their celebrations include a swing dance lesson, which I will definitely be taking part in. The museum was on the site of Robert Walpole's house. He was known as the Monarch of Chelsea because he was so powerful, and his position was the first Prime Minister of England. He ran the country, really, for the king, who was the German Hanoverian prince, King George I, succeeded by his son, George II, whose wife, Caroline, was very close to Walpole, and apparently together they ruled the country when George II was away on campaign in Europe. And Walpole himself had had to communicate with George I in their only common language, which was Latin, as he spoke no German and the king spoke no English. Carry on and turn left down Tite Street. Notice the red brick houses and many artist studios with their large windows. Chelsea was a great artist colony in the 1880s, and some of the most famous lived in this street. Walk along in the footsteps of Oscar Wilde, who wrote The Importance of Being Earnest here, and Peter Warlock, the composer and father of the art critic Brian Sewell. Wilde was writing in his study one day and was amazed to look out of the window and see Ellen Terry, the famous actress, getting out of a carriage at the bottom of the street in full Lady Macbeth costume. This was a long green dress and red plaits of hair that reached down below her waist. She disappeared into the studio of John Singer Sargent, who was at number 35. And you can see the marvellous portrait that resulted in the Tate Britain. Wilde is supposed to have looked at this scene and said that Chelsea was full of marvellous possibilities. Next door to Sargent's studio, James McNeill Whistler built himself a house. He was a prickly but brilliant American artist who'd settled in London, having trained in Paris. There's a statue of him down by the river. He never actually lived in the house, however, because he was bankrupted by a libel suit that he brought against the art critic John Ruskin, who had derided one of his now famous paintings of fireworks over the River Thames. It was part of a series called Nocturnes that were intended to create a mood in the viewer, provoking an emotional response, and were almost abstract. That was quite shocking at the time, and Ruskin was not a fan. Anyway, he wrote that Whistler was a coxcomb who flung a pot of paint in the public's face, and it wasn't worth the 200 guineas that Whistler was asking for the painting. I can't include a photo for copyright reasons, but you can Google Whistler and these paintings will come up. Whistler won the case, but got such small damages that the expense of it completely ruined him. And the house had to be sold, and it's since been demolished. Next, either turn right or walk down to the embankment and turn right. If you turned left, you could see the other side of the Royal Hospital. But turn right and look at some of the interesting houses here right on the road that look over the river. Then turn right again into Swan Walk. Follow the wall on your left until you come to a black gate with this sign outside. Here is the Chelsea Physic Garden. There's been a physic garden on this site since 1673, and it's the oldest in London. Apothecaries researched and developed plants for medicine, and the society still exists in the City of London at Blackfriars. The garden is now run by a trust and pays £5 a year rent to Cadogan for the garden. This came about thanks to our friend Hans Sloane, who gave the land to the apothecaries in 1722, provided they used it for growing medicines. They still do, and also other things were grown there, like, for example, the cottonseed that became the foundation of the American cotton industry. Sloane had done an apprenticeship there and clearly appreciated its work. Go in one day or join as a friend and go in free. It's really lovely for summer dining, and it's a beautiful venue for weddings and parties as well. But there's so much more to it as well, so do take a tour and keep an eye open for the bees because they keep bees and make honey there as well. Next, let's stroll virtually along Cheyne Walk. With its grand houses and mixture of quite interesting architectural styles, it's had an equally interesting mix of residents. First of all, see number 3 on the right, where Keith Richards lived and painted his sitting room purple. Next door, number 4, is where George Eliot, the novelist, aka Mary Ann Evans, died just months after finally marrying her much younger lover. So quite sad. That house now belongs to Michael Bloomberg, and he's got some rather fine stone American eagles in the front garden. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister during World War I and great friend of Winston Churchill, lived at number 10. And further along at number 16 lived Dante Gabriel Rossetti, with his eccentric friends such as the poet Algernon Swinburne, who coined the phrase art for art's sake, referring to the aesthetic art movement of the late 1800s that Rossetti was a big part of, having formerly been one of the founder members of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood of young artists who set up a secret society in 1848 in order to promote what they saw as good art. But he also kept a menagerie of exotic animals in his garden, and these included, for example, a wombat and a kangaroo, and I think the neighbours used to complain quite a lot. At the end of the row, there's a passageway that goes to a mews behind the houses, and this was the site of King Henry VIII's manor. Then it became Hans Sloane's Cheyne Manor, and all pulled down eventually. Many of the women in Henry's life lived there. These included Anna of Cleves, who he divorced but didn't behead, and Catherine Parr, who outlived him in the end. Both these queens were kind to Henry's 2 disinherited daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, and the girls spent time at Chelsea. In the end, they both also became Queens of England. So if you think about it, Chelsea has always had an interesting and eclectic mix of residents, and still does today. Now carry on and cross over Oakley Street, where David Bowie lived for a while, and pass Albert Bridge on your left. Built in 1873, it still has its toll booth, not functioning these days, and a sign telling troops to break step while marching across it, to stop it from wobbling. Go past David Wynn's beautiful boy and dolphin sculpture, which was a memorial to his son, and along the second section of Cheyne Walk. Here you'll come to Carlisle Mansions, otherwise known as Writer's Block, where Henry James, Somerset Maugham, T.S. Eliot and Ian Fleming all had lodgings. Up Lawrence Street, you can still find the house of Thomas Carlyle, who was otherwise known as the Sage of Chelsea. It's now, it's now a National Trust museum and is preserved as it would have been in his day, including his soundproof writing room right on the top floor. While I haven't read his history of the French Revolution, it is supposed to be very good, and now might just be the time to read it. And I do appreciate some of the things that he had to say about Chelsea. He said it was very dirty and confused in some places, but quite beautiful in others. He also said it was abounding in antiquities and traces of great men. Well, to that phrase I would add, and great women. Otherwise, I rather agree with him. Chelsea Old Church was the parish church of the Manor of Chelsea since the 14th century. It was badly bombed during World War II and subsequently rebuilt. Sir Hans Sloane is buried in the churchyard, and he has a fine monument there. Another illustrious Chelsea resident, and as far as I know, the only one to have been made a saint, was Sir Thomas More. And his statue sits just outside the church on the embankment in the garden. A nice reminder of the fact that he worshipped at that church and even sang in the choir there. He owned the manor of Beaufort and had a very fine house built, Beaufort House, on the site of modern-day Beaufort Street, of course. The only bit of that house that I know of that is still standing was the gateway, and that's been moved to Chiswick House, so you can go and see it there in the garden. It was designed by the architect Inigo Jones. Thomas More's statue is modern, has a broken chain around his neck, symbolising his execution for refusing to support Henry VIII's takeover of the Church of England so that he could annul his first marriage and be free to marry Anne Boleyn. Across the garden, next to the church, is a tall grey stone hall attached to a neo-Gothic house on the riverside. The hall was part of Thomas More's house, which used to stand in the City of London, but was moved here in the early 1900s, and it's called Crosby Hall. Thomas More was executed in July 1535 for refusing to repudiate the Pope. He's buried in St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London, but you can still see the restored chapel he gave to Chelsea Old Church. So that brings me to the end of my Chelsea walk, Emma Walks Chelsea. I hope you've enjoyed it and that it's been a little bit illuminating about some of the characters and places of Chelsea. I'm afraid it's no substitute for a real walk with a real guide, so I do hope that one day when we're all able to move around again, that you'll come and join me in a real Blue Badge Guide walking experience, which will of course end with a drink in one of the fantastic pubs of Chelsea. For example, the Surprise or the Cooper's Arms. Anyway, there are lots of them. So I hope this has been fun, and if it has, may I just ask one small favour, that if you feel like it and you feel moved to help, I've been volunteering for the Smile Brigade based in Fulham, taking food parcels and hot cooked food to vulnerable residents of the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. And if you felt like donating to them, I've given the link on my Instagram page where you could make a donation. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this and hope you'll listen to me again soon. Thank you so much and goodbye.